Red Bull will be worse in 2024, and that's something their own boss believes. In the battle with Mercedes, Red Bull were pretty much one of the steadiest rivals to the Brackley team through the 2017-21 period of F1 history. Whilst Ferrari and Sebastian Vettel fumbled the ball many times, and McLaren were going through an existential crisis, which Mercedes arguably are going through right now, the Milton Keynes team seemingly were the only ones who could rise to the occasion and topple the juggernaut that was Mercedes. Throughout the fandom were pleading, begging them, please stop Mercedes dominating everything, be the ones to beat them. And then they were the ones to beat Mercedes. And now everyone's going, please stop Red Bull dominating. Oh, God. None of these teams can win, can they? But Christian Horner reckons that Red Bull's efforts, which have paid off handsomely since 2022, will eventually be eroded, and that it will be very difficult to match or better the 2023 campaign. Which I think is pretty pragmatic, because how can you beat near perfection? Now I know some of you may not like Red Bull or Christian Horner or Max Verstappen or anything to do with the energy drink, but the point is that statistically, it has been a really dominant season. You cannot deny that. The facts and the stats, Wikipedia, it all says that they did good this season. And I'm sorry, Toto, that's just the way it is. This was a very, very convincingly dominant season. And Christian's looking to your team, Toto, as the prime example as to how this all could easily end. All of this despite them working on the RB20 as far back as the summer, which should actually send shockwaves throughout the entire grid and make everybody feel incredibly morose. Here, let me give you a quote. Ahem. We saw that in 2020 with Mercedes. If you remember, that was their most dominant year ever, and yet we were able to beat them in 2021. There is a subtle rule change, but I think that nothing stands still. We've seen competitors coming closer at different venues, and I'm sure concepts will converge. Stable regulations always concertina. I don't think we'll ever be able to repeat the season that we've had, but hopefully we can take the lessons from the RB19 and apply them to the RB20 and come up with a car that we can defend these titles with. So from that statement, Christian is saying that things are looking quite good for the next one, but they don't expect it to be immediately as good or better than the RB19. That things could happen. But those rule changes that Christian was referring to were the 2021 tweaks, which flew under the radar for most people because it didn't really seem all that spectacular, and then 2022 was coming around. Those were bigger. But those rule changes made a big difference. Mercedes were hit hard by them. Aston Martin even harder because they were copying the Mercedes concept, and that rule change, which adjusted the floor, affected the brake ducts, what wings you could have there, as well as the diffuser limitations, that affected a lot of teams. Aston Martin falling down so hard, they had just over half the points of AlphaTauri. And considering that they were in contention for third place in the championship in 2020, that's a big drop. And Christian's right to be concerned and point this out, because we're getting a similar raft of rule tweaks potentially in 2025 that are meant to address the dirty air problems that ground effect was supposed to reduce. But those plucky engineers have come around with solutions, and it all has something to do with outwash, as in spreading the air out and making the air behind all tricky so cars can't keep up with other cars. These aren't very big changes, but on the surface the 2021 adjustments didn't seem all that big, but they made waves in the results. These new rule changes will focus on the front wing, the side skirts of the floor, and brake ducts again, and winglets being placed there, being restricted. These rule changes could affect all of the cars in some way. The RB21 might be affected and compromised as well. Mercedes might come up with a tweak that could see them being faster. We don't know for sure. It could do anything, it could do nothing. But that jeopardy is there, and that is something that all of the teams, especially Red Bull, are taking seriously. Since that's what caused Mercedes' downfall in 2021. All of this realism is something really important to take into future seasons, that other teams can better them in some way, and it's up to them to make sure that doesn't happen, which is something that Mercedes have been really struggling with, coping with the fact that they are not the fastest anymore, and what made them really strong is simply not enough to be able to get back to the top. But don't worry, I'm sure Mercedes will get there eventually. And you do get a sort of convergence, that all teams get to within maybe a second of one another, which is what we saw in Abu Dhabi. In qualifying, at one point, all of the drivers within 1 second of the leading man. That is really, really close in Formula 1. To me, a 3-second gap from the top to the bottom seems perfectly reasonable. 1 second? That's a lot. And I think at one point throughout the season, it was down to 7/10. So in qualifying, it's crazy. Race pace, that's a whole other matter, because Red Bull, they've geared towards race performance rather than qualifying, which is what Ferrari have done the opposite of in some ways. But you do feel a sense of hope that 2024 will be better and Red Bull won't be quite as assured, but you never know what Adrian Newey has been consuming, do you? They claim that the RB20 will be an evolution, not a whole new concept, but what else do they need to do? The RB19 was meant to be an evolution, and it turned out to be one of the most dominant cars in F1's history. What does that say? So there are just cause for other teams to go, oh god, we're going to go through this all over again? There's that level of uncertainty, which does make the winter break all the more intriguing. And for us content creators, we could just keep on speculating. But in all seriousness, who could possibly challenge them? Well, let's look at the options, shall we? On paper, there are the likes of Mercedes, Ferrari, McLaren, and Aston Martin. Yes, I do put Aston Martin here. They could all be genuine contenders in challenging Red Bull and maybe going for the title themselves. But there is a snag here, and something that Red Bull excelled at throughout the entire season. They don't have wobblies, which we saw plenty of with those other 4 teams. All of this contributing to Red Bull just romping away with victories and getting the titles without all that much difficulty. I'd like you to think for a second and recall any big gaffes that Red Bull had throughout the entire season. I bet that you're struggling to come up with any. Mercedes started off weak, but did improve. They were consistent enough to be second place at the end of the day, but not really troubling Red Bull on the regular. Ferrari sacrificed performance for reliability from 2022, and that didn't prove to be the correct formula to beat Red Bull. And they also had to deal with operational gremlins at the same time, that are slowly being addressed. And then Fred Vasseur openly admits that reliability trick didn't even ultimately work. Aston Martin, well, they did start off incredibly strong, as we all know, with Fernando Alonso's efforts and all of those podiums which were remarkable and were key in getting him 4th place in the drivers' standings in terms of countback. But, of course, as we all knew, that their downfall was the fact that their upgrades simply didn't work. They made the car worse. However, they were able to address that just in time before we got to the winter break, and they've managed to correct some of that and be somewhat competent again, as in we can expect them to score a decent amount of points in a weekend instead of just being outside of the points. But at least they were able to pull a hard reset and admit their own mistakes. And then we also know about McLaren's terrible start. I know all too well. Which seems to be a regular thing at the moment for McLaren. They always seem to have a really bad start lately. And then they had that meteoric rise after Silverstone to be almost the top scoring team after the summer break. Something that they are no stranger to, after they did the same thing in 2009. But still, those first 7 races were incredibly damaging for the Woking team. It's a miracle that they could even catch up, but at least they were able to admit their own mistakes with the 2022 concept. They did a complete reset over the winter break, and that led to them going into 2023 with a thoroughly compromised car that they didn't really believe in. They had to just stomach it out until Baku when things could start turning around, which meant they really couldn't make a dent in the fight for second place in the championship. Makes you wonder, had McLaren been good from the get-go, which we think will happen in 2024, starting with the MCL60 of Silverstone, they probably would be second place in the Constructors easily, with Lando third in the championship, best of the rest, or very close to toppling Checo from his precarious second, and Oscar potentially scoring more than George Russell. Of course, these are all hypotheticals, and you may even call me biased with the fact that I'm blowing so much smoke up McLaren's bottom. Well, to save you the trouble of writing it down in the comments, I'll just wear the bobble hat right now for you, just to save the pain. And besides, it's really cold up here. Those comments that Christian made about ebbs and flows, he's got a point. Red Bull produced a strong car, operated without any flaws throughout, and had 2 drivers which finally gave the team the clean sweep of championships they so desperately wanted. What about the other teams? They didn't have this level of consistency throughout the entire season. All 4 teams had moments when they were pretty good, and then there were moments where they were terribly bad. That contributing to Red Bull's dominance even more. Mercedes' crisis of confidence, Lewis Hamilton going through the data himself, being a detective there, saying that Verstappen was coasting throughout the entire time. Well, no wonder he was coasting. There were moments when the teams just had no idea what to do to counter them. Ferrari have been sorting themselves out currently, so it's a crapshoot as to what 2024 will bring for them. And Aston are still going through their 5-year plan, which, unlike Alpine's old one, is actually working. McLaren, though? You do get the feeling that they have got everything sorted out and in place to mount a somewhat compelling challenge toward Red Bull. Like, there's really not much left to do except the little things. Maybe you can argue that they really need to sort out their strategies, because that has been something that they've really been sort of weak on. There have been moments throughout the entire season where I've just looked at them doing these weird calls and badly timed pit stops before safety cars, which admittedly sometimes they can't help, but you just go, oh for God, McLaren, what are you doing? There are moments when they do drop the ball, of course they do, but it's not been as bad as Ferrari. But when you step back and look at the bigger picture, they do seem like the most composed team that aren't Red Bull. They have done the time. They have served their penance and they have come out of it all the stronger, which is something Ferrari and Mercedes need to do themselves, kind of. Their drivers are exciting, their work ethos is very healthy and very clear that the team comes first, so team orders thankfully might not be that much of a pain, and their team principal has passed the test of competence. But I will admit it did look shaky at the start of the year. Their car finally is looking like in a good place to start off 2024 with, and they have also been working on the 2024 car since July, around about the same time as Red Bull started work on the RB20, or really kicking that into high gear. Both McLaren and Red Bull stopped major developments on the car around about the same time as Singapore. McLaren did bring some tweaks, and one little tweak sort of went under the radar in Vegas, but it was a very important one, and something that Red Bull really exploited at the beginning of the season. Everyone was trying to scratch their heads, going, how on earth are they so good down the straight? Their DRS advantage. Sure, the other teams will figure this out themselves, but the MCL60 seems to have gotten a better handle on it. They were the fastest car in Brazil at one point, not the fastest package. Max in the RB19, still the best. But McLaren's aero is still a weak point, but they brought with them to Vegas a new beam wing. That's the lower part of the rear wing that causes it to have structure. And that one time earlier in the year, the Alpine's one was so bad it was wobbling around all over the place. Yeah, Ferrari had that problem too. But McLaren were modifying key parts of the rear end of the car as well, which made the RB19 so fast in DRS areas, and they didn't need to have such a skinny wing, which meant they could be fast in the corners still. Yes, I know, you could probably say that, oh, what does it even matter? Everyone's now bowing down to Red Bull, they're just copying them. They're not innovating, they're just cloning. Well, that happens in Formula 1. The fastest car gets copied in some shape or form. Sometimes they get copied too hard. Racing point. I seriously think though that McLaren, from a team-wide perspective, not just the car and drivers, can be the ones to really give Red Bull a little bit of a scare. Of course, the Ferrari and Mercedes cars will improve. The Ferrari Project 676 idea seems rather compelling. The W15 is reportedly going to be all new, their third overhaul in 3 years. Not exactly a word of confidence for the Mercedes fans, but at least it's some progress. But with those teams, there are some question marks. And you can also tell that the F1 organisers are pretty keen that another team catches up to Red Bull and provides some good action, as viewing figures and interest in F1 is starting to slip. Stefano Domenicali coming out saying that McLaren is a really good example of how teams can progress over the season, and that the cost cap isn't a factor in teams getting the edge over their competitors. And they're pretty much going to McLaren, please be good, we do not need another 2023 next year, please think of the money! And I think McLaren have got something that Ferrari and Mercedes are only just figuring out that they need to do. They need to stop throwing money at the problems, because they literally cannot do that, and instead work smarter. That Red Bull cost cap punishment, the ATR time, doesn't really matter, because what things they did bring to the wind tunnel were things that were guaranteed to provide some kind of positive effect. That's what McLaren have been doing. Throughout the entire season, the upgrades that McLaren have brought have worked. Sometimes massively worked, which is something that failed with Aston Martin, but they are working with outdated technology. They were working with just outmoded data that didn't quite correlate well with real life conditions, and they are building a new wind tunnel, so they will figure that out eventually as part of their 5-year plan. Ferrari and Mercedes need to adapt to what Aston Martin and Red Bull are doing and work smarter with their wind tunnel time. They can't just put every single upgrade they come up with and expect it to work. If it doesn't work, then that's time wasted. They need to be sleeker, more agile, stealthier. McLaren's been through all of that since 2018, having that existential crisis, which has seen them just shrink down a little bit, focus more, and then just realize that whatever things we bring to the car has to work. We can't just throw money because we simply don't have it. There was a period in 2020 when it looked like the team could have gone under. Thankfully, they're not in that position anymore. And perhaps finally for 2024, they can have a season where they are starting off strongly instead of being compromised for the first few races. We need that, McLaren fans. We really need that. So I and the Formula One figureheads agree that McLaren could be the one that could really give Red Bull a challenge. And Christian Horner reckons that a team will be able to step up to the plate eventually, and it could be the papaya one. But either way, I think Max Verstappen will relish a challenge from either Oscar Piastri or Lando Norris. But why am I this confident though that McLaren can be the ones to take on Red Bull? If you watch this video next, you'll find out why I think their time of worry, their dark age, is well and truly over.